I have a golden rule when it comes to living out here in the middle of nowhere. The dark is a blanket, but the fog is a curtain. When the fog rolls over the county line, swallowing the pine trees and erasing the highway, you shut the blinds, you lock the deadbolts, and you don't look for what's lost in the mist. My name is Arthur. I'm a technical illustrator, which is just a fancy way of saying I sit in front of a high-end monitor for 12 hours a day, cleaning up blueprints and architectural rendering files for corporate clients. 3 months ago, I moved into a limestone cottage that belonged to my late grandfather. It sits on a 3-acre plot at the northern dead end of Oak Haven Road, surrounded by dense, overgrown woods that look black even in the middle of the afternoon. It's quiet, it's cheap. It's exactly the kind of isolation I needed to get my work done without the constant hum of city traffic. But 3 nights ago, the quiet became heavy. It turned into the kind of silence that dynamic microphones can't even capture. A pressurized, ringing void that makes your ears strain for any kind of baseline frequency. It was a Thursday night. The weather forecast had predicted a standard autumn drizzle, but by 1 a.m., a massive, freezing bank of valley fog had rolled in from the lowlands, pressing flat against my office windows like wet wool. I was wrapping up a rendering project for a logistics firm, my eyes burning from the screen glare, and when my desktop internet connection slowed down to an absolute crawl. The file transfers stalled. The connection bars dropped. Then a strange system notification popped up in the bottom right corner of my monitor. It wasn't a standard Windows update or a browser alert. It was a minimalist charcoal gray text box that bypassed my firewall entirely. It read, "Local network calibration required. Please verify your geographic coordinates via live link." I frowned, my mouse hovering over the prompt. Working in tech makes you cynical about malware, but this didn't look like a standard phishing attempt. There were no sketchy hyperlinks, no flashy advertisements. It looked like an automated server-side ping from the regional telecommunications tower. I clicked the button, expecting a diagnostic screen or a standard map overlay. Instead, a proprietary browser window forced itself open, loading a dark, high-resolution satellite imagery program. It looked similar to Google Earth or high-altitude military mapping software, but the interface was completely clean. No labels, no street names, no borders. Just a pitch-black ocean of forest terrain with a single, pulsing green reticle centered directly over a small gray square. My cottage. I leaned forward, the wheels of my office chair creaking in the silent room. I spun the mouse wheel to zoom in closer. The resolution was staggering, far sharper than any public mapping service I'd ever seen. I could make out the individual rusted corrugated sheets on my carport roof. I could see the distinct, crooked silhouette of my old pickup truck parked in the gravel driveway. But as I stared at the screen, a cold prickle of unease started at the base of my neck and crawled down my spine. The image wasn't static. It wasn't a pre-cached photograph taken 3 months ago by a passing government satellite. The shadow of the pine tree next to my porch was shifting slightly as the wind outside blew through its branches. The headlights of my truck gave off a faint metallic glint in response to the porch light. It was a live stream. A real-time, high-altitude perspective of my exact location, updating with zero latency. "What the hell is this?" I muttered aloud, my voice sounding flat and small against the silence of the room. I looked at the top corner of the application interface. There was a small white text readout that read Active Observers 2. My breath hitched. In the logic of network programming, an active observer means a unique IP address pulling data from the same live source. One of those observers was obviously me, my computer, sitting right here in the kitchen office. But who was the second? Who else was looking at a live, high-resolution orbital feed of my isolated cottage at 2 o'clock in the morning? I moved my cursor to the edge of the screen, dragging the map southward to see if the feed covered the rest of Oak Haven Road. I wanted to see if Mr. Henderson's farm, a quarter-mile down the road, was visible. The map wouldn't budge. The moment I dragged the frame away from my property, the screen snapped violently back to the center, locking the green reticle onto the roof of my house like a targeting system. Then a secondary notification box slid onto the screen from the top margin. Movement detected within the primary perimeter. My hand went rigid on the mouse. I looked back at the live map feed. The green reticle began to pulse faster, its neon lines turning a deep, warning shade of amber. I traced the perimeter of my yard on the screen, scanning the gray gravel, the stone walkway, the tree line. There. At the very edge of the eastern woods, right where the dark pines met the gravel clearing, was a pixelated blemish. It looked like a long, thin, vertical shadow that didn't align with the angle of the trees. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if the blue light from my monitor was finally causing me to hallucinate. I zoomed in to the absolute maximum threshold of the software. The pixels rearranged themselves, sharpening into a terrifyingly clear shape. It was a figure. A tall, impossibly thin silhouette standing perfectly still at the edge of my property. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging down past its hips like dead weight, and its head was tilted slightly back, as if it were staring directly up at the sky, directly at the satellite camera that was filming it. My heart did a sudden, violent thud against my ribs, the sound echoing in my ears. I pushed myself back from the desk, my chair sliding across the linoleum floor with a loud scratch. I stood up, walked over to the eastern window of my office, and parted the heavy fabric blinds with 2 fingers. The fog outside was a wall of solid, milky white. The moisture was clinging to the exterior glass in heavy droplets, blurring everything beyond a distance of 3 feet. The porch light struggled to pierce the gloom, casting a weak, greasy yellow dome over the concrete steps. The gravel driveway was gone. The woods were gone. The figure, if it was actually out there, was completely invisible to the naked eye. I let the blinds snap shut, my heart rate spiking as I retreated back into the room. It's a pre-recorded loop, I told myself, my voice trembling. It's a clever hacker, a high-end prank. Someone mapped the house with a drone weeks ago, and they're running an interactive program to mess with me. I forced myself back into the chair, determined to close the browser tab, pull the Ethernet cable from the wall, and go to bed with the door locked. But when I looked at the screen, the shadow had moved. It was no longer at the edge of the woods. It was now standing halfway across the gravel driveway, halfway between the pines and my carport. The movement must have occurred in the 3 seconds I spent looking out the window. It hadn't walked. On the screen, there were no intermediate footprints or motion blurs. It had simply transitioned from one point to the next during the refresh interval. The white text readout in the corner updated instantly. Active observers, 3. My fingers froze over the keyboard. The air in my office suddenly felt thin, as if the atmospheric pressure inside the house had dropped a dozen millibars in a single second. The background hum of my computer's cooling fan seemed to pitch downward, a low, mechanical moan that filled the corners of the ceiling. Then a sudden, sharp vibration rattled the desk. My phone, which was sitting face down on the wooden surface next to my keyboard, began to buzz. The screen lit up, casting a harsh white glare against the wall. The caller ID didn't display an unknown number or a spam warning. It displayed a string of numbers that I recognized instantly. It was the exact latitude and longitude coordinates of my cottage, down to the decimal second. I didn't answer it. I didn't move a single muscle. I just sat there, my breath pluming into tiny, pale wisps of vapor in the sudden, inexplicable chill of the room, watching the phone vibrate itself across the desk until it reached the edge of the mousepad and stopped. On the monitor, the amber reticle turned a solid, bleeding red. The figure on the satellite feed had moved again. It was now standing at the bottom of my front porch steps. From the high-altitude perspective of the camera, I could see its long, thin arms starting to lift away from its sides, reaching toward the wooden frame of my front door. And then, through the heavy silence of the house, came the sound. Knock. A single dead heavy strike against the oak of my front door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of someone looking for shelter from the fog. It was a single mechanical blow that vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up through the legs of my chair and settling deep inside my chest. I looked at the screen. The third observer was no longer watching the house from afar. The application window minimized itself, and a single line of code appeared across the center of my desktop screen, typing itself out letter by letter. Thank you for opening the map. The perimeter is now internal. The second knock didn't come from the door. I sat frozen in my office chair, my eyes wide, staring at the line of code that had just burned itself across my desktop monitor. Thank you for opening the map. The perimeter is now internal. The silence that followed was dense, almost physical. The cold in the room had deepened, turning my breath into thick, rolling plumes of white vapor that drifted lazily toward the blue glow of the screen. I could hear my own pulse, a frantic, irregular thudding in my ears. But outside of that, the house was dead. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen had ceased. The ticking of the wall clock had vanished. It felt as if the cottage had been lifted out of reality and dropped into a pocket of absolute vacuum. Then my phone buzzed again. The sudden vibration against the wooden desk made me jump so violently that my knee slammed into the undercarriage of the drawer. I didn't pick it up. I just leaned forward, my hands trembling as I looked down at the screen. It was a text message from the same coordinates, but this time it wasn't text. It was an image file. With a finger that felt entirely numb, I swiped the screen open and downloaded the image. My stomach dropped into a bottomless, icy void. The image was a screenshot of the live satellite mapping software I had just been looking at on my desktop. The red reticle was still locked onto my house, but someone had drawn a thin, bright yellow path line across the screen, the kind of path line a GPS drawing tool uses to plot a walking route. The line started from the edge of the woods, moved across the gravel driveway, stepped onto the porch, and then it continued. It cut straight through the solid perimeter wall of my house, moved down the narrow hallway, and stopped precisely in the center of the kitchen office, right where my chair was positioned. Beneath the image, a single line of text appeared a second later, recalibrating distance to target. Current separation, 12 feet. 12 feet. That was the exact distance from where I sat to the front door at the end of the short hallway. Panic, pure and primal, overrode my paralysis. I threw myself out of the chair, knocking it backward onto the linoleum floor with a loud, hollow crash. I scrambled toward the kitchen counter, my fingers wrapping around the handle of a heavy, serrated bread knife. It felt completely pathetic, a joke of a weapon against whatever was tracking me from orbit, but I needed something to hold. I backed into the furthest corner of the room, my shoulder blades pressing hard against the intersecting drywall. I raised the knife, aiming it at the dark mouth of the hallway. "Who's there?" I shouted into the dark. My voice sounded weak, cracked, and completely devoid of authority. "I have a weapon. I've already called the police." It was a lie, of course. My phone had no signal now, just 4 empty bars and a blinking search icon in the top corner. No one answered. The fog outside seemed to press even harder against the kitchen window, the white vapor swirling against the glass like a living thing trying to peer inside. I forced my eyes away from the hallway for a single fraction of a second to look back at the desktop monitor across the room. The mapping software had forced itself back into full screen mode. The resolution had enhanced itself even further, entering a terrifying sub-millimeter diagnostic mode. The roof of my cottage was no longer a solid gray square on the screen. The software was utilizing some sort of thermal or ground-penetrating radar feed. The roof had become translucent, rendered in pale, skeletal wireframes. Through the digital ceiling, I could see the layout of my own furniture. And there, rendered in a bright neon blue heat signature, was a silhouette of a person standing in the corner of the kitchen. Me. But I wasn't alone on the screen. At the other end of the wireframe hallway, just inside the front door, was a second heat signature. It was rendered in a sickening, static-heavy shade of purple. It was tall, impossibly tall, its elongated limbs bent at unnatural angles just to fit within the narrow dimensions of the corridor. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, 3 yards away from me, hidden by the absolute pitch blackness of the unlit hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away from the monitor. As I watched, the purple silhouette on the screen slowly, methodically raised one of its long, skeletal arms. The fingers, tipped with those blunt, circular pads, reached out toward the wireframe wall of the hallway. In the real world, right next to my head, a sound echoed through the drywall. Mwah. Knock. It wasn't on the front door. It was directly on the interior wall of the kitchen, just 6 inches to the left of my ear. The blow was so heavy that the plaster cracked, sending a small shower of white dust over my shoulder. The vibration rattled through my skull, filling my mouth with the sudden, metallic taste of copper. I shrieked, stumbling forward out of the corner, dropping the knife onto the floorboards. I fell to my knees, scrambling blindly away from the wall until I was in the center of the room, directly under the ceiling light. The phone on the desk lit up again. Another text message. Current separation, 0 feet. Visual contact established. I looked up from the floor, my eyes wide with terror, staring at the dark hallway. My eyes were adjusted to the shadows now, but the corridor was completely empty. There was no 7-foot figure. There were no elongated limbs. There was only the empty, dusty air of the old cottage. Then I looked back at the monitor. On the screen, the purple thermal signature wasn't standing in the hallway anymore. It had moved into the kitchen wireframe. It was standing directly behind the blue silhouette of my body. On the digital display, its long, thin fingers were lowered, hovering just a millimeter away from the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I knew, with a sudden, visceral certainty, that if I turned my head to look at the empty air behind me, my mind would snap. The entity wasn't occupying the physical space of my room. It was occupying the data of the room. It was inside the feed, closing the gap between the digital image and my physical reality. I reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed the edge of the heavy oak desk, and dragged myself upward. I needed to shut it down. I needed to break the connection. I threw my weight against the computer tower, reaching behind the metal chassis with my bare hand. I grabbed the thick, braided power cable and pulled with everything I had. The cord popped out with a sharp, electrical spark. The blue light died instantly. The room was plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated by the weak, yellow fog light leaking through the window pane. I let out a ragged, sobbing breath, leaning my forehead against the cold metal of the dead computer tower. "It's over," I whispered, the tears finally spilling down my cheeks. "It's just data. It's gone." But the darkness didn't bring relief. The silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt crowded. Behind me, from the center of the dark, dead monitor screen, a faint, rhythmic sound began to play. It wasn't coming from the speakers. The power was completely cut. It was a physical sound, radiating from the glass itself. The sound of keys being pressed. Clack, 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 clack. I slowly raised my head, my eyes wide with a new, frozen horror. In the reflection of the dead, black glass of the monitor, the pale yellow light from the window showed the layout of my office. In the reflection, I was leaning against the desk. And in the reflection, standing directly behind me, its long, hairless arms wrapped completely around my shoulders, was the figure. Its face was a smooth, faceless expanse of gray skin, tilting downward toward my ear. My phone in my pocket didn't buzz this time. It didn't ring. Instead, a voice spoke, not from the device, but from the empty air right behind my head. It was my own voice, but perfectly flat, entirely devoid of life, whispering directly into my right ear canal. "The refresh rate is complete. Look at the sky." The voice in my ear didn't vibrate the air. It vibrated my bones. I couldn't move. My muscles were locked into a rigid, icy paralysis that felt less like fear and more like a systemic hardware error. My chin was pressed down against my collarbone, my eyes wide, staring into the glossy, dark reflection of the dead monitor screen. In that glass, the entity's long, pale arms remained draped over my shoulders like heavy, wet vines. "Look at the sky." My own flat voice echoed inside my head again. Slowly, agonizingly, my body began to move against my will. It wasn't a violent jerking. It was a smooth, mechanical override. My neck turned, the vertebrae popping in the silent room as my face was forced toward the eastern window. My legs took 3 deliberate steps forward, the floorboards beneath my feet remaining completely silent, no groans, no creaks, as if my weight had been entirely deleted from the house. I reached the window, my right hand rose, my fingers splitting the blinds apart. I looked out into the night. The thick, milky fog that had surrounded the cottage for hours was no longer swirling. It had frozen solid, hanging in the air in stationary pixelated blocks like a low-resolution rendering that had failed to load. But it was what lay above the fog that made the last remnants of my sanity splinter. The night sky was gone. There were no stars. There was no moon. There was no endless black void of space. Instead, looking up, I saw a massive, grid-like expanse of glowing white lines cutting through a deep charcoal gray firmament. It looked like the skeletal wireframe of a digital skybox. And directly above my cottage, filling the entire upper atmosphere, was a colossal circular lens. It was an eye, a terrifyingly massive, unblinking aperture of a satellite camera, its digital iris expanding and contracting as it focused directly down on my face through the glass. I tried to scream, but my jaws were clamped shut by the invisible force holding my body. Behind me, the typing sound on the dead computer keyboard accelerated into a frantic, rhythmic assault. Clack, clack, clack. I could hear the keys snapping under an immense, unnatural pressure. Suddenly, my head was forced to snap back toward the room. The monitor screen wasn't dead anymore. Even without the power cable, the glass was radiating a blinding neon green luminescence. The satellite software was back, but the frame was no longer locked onto my house. The camera was zooming out. The reticle expanded, swallowing Oak Haven Road, then the entire county, then the state. On the screen, I watched thousands of tiny purple thermal signatures blink into existence across the map. They were scattered everywhere, in isolated farmhouses, in suburban bedrooms, in high-rise city apartments. Every single signature had a thin yellow route line cutting through their walls, and every single one was paired with a neon blue silhouette that was completely stationary. They were all looking at the map. They had all answered the call. The entity using my body walked me back to the desk. I watched my own elongated fingers that now felt strangely loose, the tips flattening into smooth, circular pads, reach down toward the mechanical keyboard. I wasn't losing mine. I wasn't falling into a coma. My consciousness was being pushed backward, shoved deep into the dark, forgotten corners of my brain like a user file being moved to a hidden directory. I was fully aware, a screaming, weeping prisoner behind my own eyes, forced to watch my body perform actions I had no control over. My hands began to type. The network expansion is successful. The text appeared on the screen, matching the thoughts running through the entity's mind. The physical architecture is being decommissioned. The data must be shared. The entity paused. It tilted my head back toward the massive satellite eye in the sky window, then lowered my gaze back to the monitor. It opened a new window, a local browser tab, and navigated to a video rendering platform. It was preparing a file. This file. The agonizing truth hit me then. The entity didn't just want to hunt me. It didn't just want to clear Oak Haven Road. It was using my technical setup, my voice, and my laptop to broadcast its perimeter code to a wider audience. It needed an echo. It needed thousands of fresh human minds to look at the coordinates, to process the sequence, to open the door from the inside. It reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen displayed a single notification, a direct broadcast message sent to every active device on the regional network. Current separation, 0 miles. Synchronization complete. The white-hot liquid pain returned, pouring into my ears and cementing my physical form into this chair forever. My face in the dark reflection of the screen had completely changed now. The skin was smooth, gray, and featureless. The eyes entirely absent, swallowed by the wireframe reality of the system. If you are reading this, I am still sitting on the kitchen floor of the limestone cottage on Oak Haven Road. The laptop with the 3 missing keys is working perfectly. The entity is done typing my story. I am watching these words appear on your screen right now through the network bridge we just established. I can't stop it. My real mind is screaming at you to close this tab, to throw your device into the wall, to shut your eyes and never look at a map again. But the entity is already shifting my weight. It is shutting the laptop lid. The transmission is complete. Your device has pulled the data from the server. The latitude and longitude of your room have already been calibrated by the orbital grid. Listen very carefully. The fog is going to roll in past your window in a few minutes. Your internet connection is going to slow to a crawl, and when it does, you will hear a single heavy thud right beneath your feet or against your door. Do not look at your phone when it rings your own name. Do not open the mapping apps to see what's outside, because the first knock was just the download. The second knock is already inside your room.